All right, we are on our final lecture, Analyzing the Interview. Here's our quote for this lecture. Real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance. I think that's a pretty powerful quote. To know how much we really don't know is quite powerful. The more educated you become, the more you realize there's so much more to learn. And maybe you felt this way during your interview. The more you got to know the person you interviewed, the more you realize that there is quite a bit more to learn. Now that you've completed your interview, you might find yourself in one of a few different places. You might be thinking, well, wow, that went well. I feel so much better. Or you might be thinking, oh, that did nothing for me. Or maybe you're thinking, well, crap, that couldn't have gone worse. Now, trust me when I say that no matter where you find yourself right now, you really are better off than you were before. You've gained knowledge about yourself, and absolutely you've gained knowledge about the person you interviewed. Even if they sat there silently staring at you, trust me, you've gained knowledge. And you know the old saying that knowledge is power. Now, what you decide to do with that knowledge is the key. So let's look at how we can use this interview to our greatest advantage and gain power over the knowledge we have obtained. So what should I do first? That's the question you may be asking yourself. I want you to think back about the last weeks that we've had together. We discussed you language, conflict, problem solving groups, perception, and a lot more. Now that you have interviewed your person, how might that interview fit into the discussions we have had over the past weeks? This is what you want to consider when analyzing the interview. Start with thinking about your perception of the person and any biases or prejudices that you might have led you to ask certain questions or respond in certain ways. So are there any biases? Are there any prejudgments that you may have that led you to ask a question in a certain way? Maybe I said something about a question being leading, or maybe I made a comment that will lead to a defensive response. Why did you ask the question in the way you did? Are there any judgments, prejudgments, biases that maybe led you to ask certain questions in certain ways? Think about your self-esteem and your overall self-concept. Did your level of self-esteem lead you to word things a certain way or to misread certain statements? Think about your language. How did you phrase your comments and your questions? How were the responses phrased back to you? What kind of language did they use? Was there a lot of you language? These and many, many more are the sort of things that you should be considering when reflecting on this interview. So what action do you need to take? Sit down with your notes from the interview and another fresh sheet of paper or a blank Word document if that's your way of doing things. Go through each question, considering your motivations for asking the questions and how you felt when you heard the responses to those questions. On your blank document, type or write what conclusions you come to regarding your motivations and feelings after reading through all those notes. And then what? Then what do you do? The next step is to look for trends. Now that you've taken notes about your motivations and your feelings during each interview question, you want to see if there are any trends among those motivations or feelings. So for example, when thinking about your motivations, did you find two or more questions where you think your goal might have been to get them to admit they're wrong? That might be something to consider. Or when looking at your feelings and reactions to the responses, were there two or more questions in which you felt encouraged because you felt you understood their behavior more clearly? These are just a few examples of trends you might find. There are many, many more that you could potentially discover when looking at your interview notes and thinking back. So what action should you take? On a new document or a new sheet, write down any trends you see. Look for similar motivations or reactions to questions. Okay? And finally, what's my final move? Hopefully now you've done a full analysis of the interview. You should by now understand clearly what your motivation and emotions were before, during, and after the interview. You should also have a document that clearly lays out your motivations and your reactions as well as any trends that you might have seen arise. You are now ready to write the final part of the communication project. So, what action should you take? Let's look at these actions. Read through the notes you just took and then follow the instructions provided for you for the assignment. So here's what we're looking for as far as content goes. You want to make sure to respond thoroughly to each of the following questions. If you would like, you can number these questions. I'm completely okay with that, but the responses cannot be in list format. They need to be a thought out, well-developed essay type response, but I am okay with you putting the numbers next to each section. That is completely fine. So let's look at the questions you need to address. Number one, an overall description of the interview process. So how did it go? Where did you meet? How did you meet? Did the interview start off well? How did it start and then progress, and then in the end, how did it complete itself? What was the physical setting of the interview? Was it in a loud restaurant? Was it on the couch in your living room? Was it over the phone because the person lives 5 states away? What was the situation? Now, hopefully it wasn't over the phone, because that was one of the things I wanted you to avoid. I did want you to be face to face, if at all possible, but in some circumstances that wasn't an option. But tell me those details. How was your relationship with the person prior to the interview? What are all those process and pre-interview situations? Number two, the second question that you want to address is, were the majority of your goals met? Now, you laid out some overall goals in the foundation sheet. You had anywhere from 2 to 3, maybe 4 or even 5 overall goals. Maybe you even had 1. It just depends. And then you had individual goals for every single question. So of those, both the ones from the questions and then your overall goals, were the majority of them met? And if they were, how? If they weren't, why do you think they weren't met? And if you would pull examples from the interview, so quotes from your interviewee, go ahead and do that in that section so that you can show me clearly what that person said and how it impacted that goal. Once you have that laid out and you have a good idea of some examples of things that would support whether a goal was met or not, if you would put a quotation, or excuse me, not a quotation, a parenthetical citation. Now, you've been doing this whole time with the textbook citation, but I would also like for you to do this with the quotes from your interview. And how to do that, I'm going to pull up a blank document here. What I want you to do is to just in parentheses, so you have put a quote, and here we are, we're going to put the word quote just because it's easy enough as is. But once you've quoted the person, in parentheses you're going to put the name of the person, and then comma, personal interview, and end quote that. And then you can continue on with the rest of the text. So go ahead and do this next to any quote from your interview. That would be preferable for documentation purposes. So that's number 2. Number 3, how did your relationship change with this person after conducting the interview? Again, tell me if anything has changed. Now, some of you, it's going to be a very short time gap between the interview and writing the summary. Others, it'll be 2 weeks. So is there any change? Now, obviously, it would be best if I could have an explanation of how things have changed months from now, but that's not possible. So if there's no change, don't worry. It very well could be that it's just a progression. Maybe you didn't really need a change, you just wanted an understanding. I don't know. It just depends. But give me kind of your perception of things. And again, use quotes like I showed earlier for anything that you pull from the interview. And number 4, what have you learned regarding your communication style before and after this class? So have you made any changes in how you communicate with this person? You yourself, do you try to avoid you language? Do you encourage them to lay out their ideas? What things have you changed with this person? And if so, if you have changed anything, has it helped? If not, why have you chosen to communicate in the way you always had? Why did you stay the same? And are there still changes that can be made that you feel would benefit the relationship? So those are some of the things that you may consider as ways to evaluate your own communication style in connection to this relationship. In addition, feel free to add in overall communication styles or overall communication discussion. It doesn't have to just be about this relationship. It can be in general as well. So those are the 4 content questions you're asking. Now make sure to read through the assignment description carefully and address all the points I mentioned. Now there are also structural requirements, and these are the structural requirements that I would like for you to keep to. Make sure that it is at minimum 3 full pages of content. That does not include the cover page and reference list. Those are separate. So 3 full pages of content, so of responses to those 4 questions, or up to 5 full pages. I don't think you'll need to go that far. Most people go about 4 pages, but if you need to go 5, please feel free. Do include a cover page. My preference is for APA, but whatever you're comfortable with is fine. I'm not very picky about the style that you use, so go ahead and use whatever you're comfortable with. So include a cover page. Please use 12-point Times New Roman font. I don't need Courier New, and I definitely don't need 16-point font. I can see all right. I do wear glasses, so at least when I'm on the computer, so I don't need you to have huge font. You can double space. If you would prefer to single space, that's fine. That would give you more content space, but I'm good with double space. That's completely appropriate. Keep it to 1-inch margins on all sides. That's pretty standard. I don't want to see 2-inch margins on either side to try and get a little bit more of the page out. And then citations for the interview, as I mentioned earlier. So you're going to put John Doe, comma, personal interview anytime you use a quotation, and you should be using quotes quite a bit. So keep your summary to these guidelines and you should do great. This assignment might have been the easiest experience you've ever had, or maybe it was the most challenging and uncomfortable. In the end, you gained knowledge either way and now have the power to improve your interpersonal relationship. Without knowledge of what it might take to improve the relationship, there is no way to make any changes. So with this new knowledge, there is hope and opportunity for that interpersonal relationship and maybe others to become more successful. And I look forward to reading your summaries. Good luck.